Have you ever been in the forest and suddenly out of nowhere something feels unexplainably wrong? You can't see anything out of the ordinary, but you just know. Like you shouldn't be there. Like the forest itself is telling you to leave. I'm here to tell you, if you're ever out in the wilderness and you feel that feeling, that overwhelming sense of dread, get out as fast as you can. Because I didn't, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was driving to check on my uncle's cabin. It was located deep in the woods. To access it with a vehicle, you had to drive down an old logging road that seemed to just get narrower and narrower until you weren't sure your car would even fit. The cabin was on the water. The easier way to get there was via boat, but I never much liked boats. Even the 20-minute ride from the other side of the river sent me into a panic. So here I was, driving down this narrow road that was overgrown with weeds and young saplings. My uncle had just bought a house down south and wanted to sell the cabin. I thought it was a strange and sudden decision, as that cabin was his pride and joy for as long as I knew him. He built it himself, so it was a shock to me that he was going to sell. Physically, he was still in good shape and was able to do all the maintenance on the property, but he said he just wanted to move on and left it at that. He kept saying he was going to get it ready, but he just never did. Both me and my dad offered to help him, but he told us to stay away from that house. Those were the words he used. Stay away from that house. After my uncle left his cabin, things started getting weird. He started talking about all sorts of crazy things like aliens and stuff. You couldn't have a normal conversation with him. The empty cabin was the least of his worries, and we all sort of forgot about it. After a particularly bad storm in the area, my grandma asked me to go take a look around the cabin and make sure nothing had been damaged. I arrived at the property, and as soon as I stepped out of the car, I knew there was something terribly wrong. There wasn't any storm damage that I could see, but something wasn't right. It was that feeling you get in the back of your mind, telling you to leave. Whatever the situation, just leave. I wasn't going to stay long. That's how I justified ignoring the feeling. It was a long drive from town because I flat out refused to take the boat, so it was getting dark by the time I arrived. I planned to just take a quick look around and drive home again. I unlocked the door with the spare key my uncle kept underneath a rock by the entryway. The inside of the cabin was in shambles. There were papers strewn about everywhere. It was just a mess. I had never known him to keep his home like this, but then again, he seemed to develop some sort of dementia in the last few months, so I didn't know quite what to think. I got caught up reading some of the papers that were lying on the kitchen counter. They talked about monsters that lived in the woods and ways to kill them. It was insane. Suddenly I heard a tap on the window. I jumped up to look outside. I guess the scary stories were getting to me. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary out there, so I figured it must have been a bird or a bug flying into the glass. But as soon as I sat back down, I heard it again. I got up again, and that time it was dark out. Just a few moments ago, I saw the sunset across the horizon, but now it was nearly pitch black. I heard the tapping again, but this time it was coming from the front door. I just knew. I knew something was out there. I ran to the door and bolted it shut. I couldn't see anything through the windows, but whatever was out there could definitely see me. There was tapping and scraping at nearly all the windows now. I went around the cabin and closed the blinds on every window, trying to make sure whatever was out there couldn't see in. I remembered reading that the monsters from the papers were attracted to lights, so I darkened the house. And then the tapping stopped. I knew then that my uncle wasn't crazy, and I knew why he didn't want to come back here. I could see my car parked out in the driveway. I desperately wanted to get to it and drive the hell away from here, but I didn't want to take the chance not knowing what was outside. I accepted that I would spend the night locked in this house, but I wanted to get a look at what exactly was out there. I had my car keys with me. If they were truly attracted to the light, then this was how I would get a look at them. I hit the lock button and the headlights turned on. All of a sudden, a dozen of these creatures came out of the forest and swarmed my car. They looked sort of human, but just sort of They were pale and bald with large eyes. They looked like they had the ability to walk upright if they wanted to, but all of the ones I saw crawled on the ground. They were fascinated by my car. I hit the horn button and it caused them to scatter, but only for a moment. As soon as it was quiet, they moved back in until the headlights shut off. They stayed away from the house as long as I kept the blinds closed and the lights out. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up reading the information my uncle had found about these creatures. I had to read under a blanket to avoid drawing them in. I couldn't find out how to get rid of them. Obviously, my uncle couldn't either. They were gone by daybreak, and so was I. The cabin still sits alone in the forest. My uncle still owns it and has no intention of doing anything with it. He said, "Let the forest have it," and after what I saw, I agree with him. I'm sure you've heard that all of us have a doppelganger somewhere in the world. That's something that has been told to me at least a dozen times in my life. It's always said by someone who seems to have a little bit of scientific basis for the claim, but is never presented as a fact with any kind of proof or sources. You've probably also heard from people who claim to have met their doppelganger, or maybe you've even seen yours. So, with that in mind, what I'm about to tell you will probably seem underwhelming at first, but I promise this was more than a doppelganger. This was some cross-dimension weirdness that I have never been able to wrap my head around. In August of 1996, I was a 10-year-old kid with a 13-year-old brother and a 6-year-old sister. Our dad had died earlier in the summer in a car accident. He had been on his way to the store for my mom, who had forgotten to buy milk during the weekly grocery trip that morning. Mom had a really hard time with it. Not only with losing Dad, but also she blamed herself for it, even though it wasn't her fault at all. As a result of blaming herself, she had slipped into a depressed funk. My older brother had been doing most of the parenting for the last couple of months, even though he was barely a teenager. And each of us was grieving in our own way, so we were a very different family than we had been just months earlier. At the time of Dad's death, we were planning a family trip to Disney World. Mom was committed to taking us still, even in her weakened emotional state, because it was something Dad had been looking forward to. So in August, as planned, we got in the car and took the drive down to Orlando from Atlanta, where we live. It would be about a 7-hour drive. The day we got to Disney started out seemingly normal for a day at Disney. We went on rides, saw the sights, and just generally enjoyed ourselves as much as possible. It wasn't until the haunted house ride that things started to get a little strange. That ride was surprisingly sentimental, and after watching the ghosts, still in love and dancing through the walls with the loves of their lives, Mom needed a moment to herself. She took a seat at a food station and sent me and my brother to take our little sister to meet Minnie Mouse, who was scheduled to make an appearance shortly at one of the photo tents. We were waiting in line when suddenly we heard someone call out our names, a male voice. It sounded just like our dad. We turned and looked, and there he was, our father, frantically scanning the crowd to find us. All of us froze stiff. We didn't know what we were looking at, but we knew we could all see it and that we weren't just imagining it. I asked my brother, "Is that Dad?" And he just shook his head and said, "Can't be." But it was. He saw us and started walking toward us. My little sister ran over and jumped up in his arms, crying and hugging him. He was comforting her, saying it was okay, that he knows it's scary to be lost, but he was right there the whole time. I looked at my brother and he looked at me, and we both knew that something very weird and potentially dangerous was going on. He ran over and grabbed her out of the dad lookalike's arms. I ran with him, and we all took off as fast as we could back to where we'd left Mom. The guy took off after us, chasing us the whole way. When we got to Mom, she stood up in a hurry asking what we were so scared of. I guess she could see the fear on our faces. My sister was crying, beating on my brother's back the whole time he ran with her, screaming for him to let her down because she wanted Daddy. So, when we got to Mom, my sister was screaming, "I want Daddy," over and over again. Mom thought the haunted house had bothered her too. She took my sister in her arms and was saying, "Daddy's in heaven. Daddy's in heaven. He can still see us, though." She was trying to comfort her and calm her down, but it wasn't working. My sister pulled back away from Mom and said, "Daddy is right there." She pointed back into the crowd, and Mom looked, and she saw him too. The man that looked like Dad was standing there staring at Mom. His face was white as a sheet, and he was shaking and starting to cry. Mom looked at him with the exact same expression. She said, "Eric," and he looked back at her and said, "Laura?" Both their names were right. Then, at the exact same time, they both shook their heads and said, "You died when you went to get the milk." That's when 3 kids who looked just like me and my siblings came running through the crowd yelling for their dad. He turned, saw them, and gave us one last glance before he took off and grabbed them, leading them away before they saw us too. We didn't stay at Disney long after that. Mom hurried us out and we went to the beach and then SeaWorld for the rest of the day instead. And we never really talked about what happened that day until earlier this year after cancer took Mom. My brother, sister, and me started talking about the Disney run-in the day after Mom's funeral, and we all have different ideas about what it could have been. My brother thinks it was just a wild coincidence that some people who looked very similar to our family and had at least a couple of the same names and circumstances in their lives just happened to have been there at the same time. My little sister thinks it was a ghost and that the doubles of us were something that we just imagined in order to make sense of it over the years. Personally, I believe that somehow we crossed dimensional paths with ourselves. Maybe it was our own family living in Mom's alternate world of, what if I had gone for the milk that day instead of Dad? What if she'd never felt the need to blame herself for what happened? Would we have still seen the doppelganger or whatever it was? I guess we'll never know for sure. But I do know this. What we saw was very real, and it has affected me every single day since. My grandparents moved down to southern Florida, the Fort Lauderdale area, back in the early 2000s. And as per our family tradition, we spent almost every holiday with them. It was easily enough to ride along when I was a kid, but once I hit college, it became somewhat harder to go down from the Nashville area where I was going to school. It's a pretty straight shot, though, down I-75, but at the very bottom end of the highway down in Florida, the road cuts straight across the state through Big Cypress Preserve and a pretty wild stretch of the Everglades. Even as a kid, it struck me as a strange place to build a highway, but it's undeniably scenic. Sometimes you can even see alligators sunning themselves along the side of the highway. When we were younger and driving down with our parents, my older brother loved to taunt me about all the monsters living out in the swamp, and I used to be petrified by the time we got to our grandparents' house. Meanwhile, Fort Lauderdale isn't exactly known for its creepy, crawly creatures, apart from some massive cockroaches, but that never really did much to calm my nerves. Anyway, during college, I was heading down for Thanksgiving in 2018. I remember specifically because it was the year before Nicole hit, and I didn't make it for the next couple of years after that. I was on my way down and was pushing harder than I should have to make it. Usually I split up the 14-hour drive into 2 days, but I'd stayed in Nashville longer than I had first anticipated. That meant I was over 12 hours in when I was crossing into the National Preserve and admittedly starting to get punchy. If I really pushed, I'd make it by midnight, which I know for a fact my mom was counting on. It was late and the sun had been down so long I felt like I'd been driving in the dark forever. No amount of passenger seat snacks and caffeine could keep me focused. Besides, once you start cutting through the preserves, especially in the dark, everything takes on this super surreal quality. The nights down there can get super muggy, and thick fog can come up in a second and hang around in ways that make any kind of travel dangerous. So I was tearing my hair out because all I wanted to do was floor it and cut across that last hour and a half. Instead, fog had me fighting my way through the cypresses. So yeah, maybe I was going faster than I should have been, but I felt sure I'd be able to see taillights or headlights in time to miss anything major. And then, all of a sudden, something leapt out of the fog less than 50 feet ahead, and I slammed on the brakes. The whole car threatened to go into a spin, and I yanked on the wheel to keep from slamming into the guardrail. It had happened. I was going to hit this thing in the road, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The first thing I noticed, before seeing anything, was the smell. Not exactly like something dead, but more like an ugly mix of body odor and animal musk. I had to pull the front of my shirt up over my nose to even get close. My heart was pounding because it was definitely shaped like a person. But the more I looked, the less that actually proved to be true. The proportions were super weird, like the arms seemed too long for the body. Plus, it was covered all over with reddish hair like an orangutan, but the legs were too long for it to be that. Everything about it just seemed wrong. That plus the smell and all those stories my brother told when we were kids came rushing up like crazy. I know this sounds nuts, but I'm 1,000% sure this thing was a skunk ape. My hands started shaking and I climbed back into my car to call my dad to tell him what had happened. At that point, I didn't even know what the damage to my car was, and I felt far too rattled to drive right away. As soon as I sat down, though, this inhuman wailing started from off in the fog. Not just one voice, but several. It was impossible to tell where they were coming from, but I knew in an instant that whatever the issues with my car might be, there was no way I was waiting around. Against my better judgment, I kicked on my high beams to make up for the lost headlight and hightailed it out of there, somehow making it to my parents, but with no memory of the drive. When I finally got there, my dad was waiting up for me. I think my dad at first thought I had made it all up to keep from getting in trouble for wrecking the car. But there was no denying it when he saw how upset I was. I had been an officer of the law many years prior to becoming a part of the Railroad Transit Police. I had been working in a large city, and I wanted a change. So we moved to a smaller town, and I got a job patrolling some important and historical railroad tracks in Pennsylvania. It was quite the shift. I didn't have to deal with nearly any of the stuff I had seen in New York. It was much more peaceful. But I'll admit, I was going a little stir-crazy after about a month or two. It was literally just too quiet. My daily duties were pretty simple and were as follows. Don't let anyone get into trouble. It was really rare when I had an occurrence where I needed to really be the enforcer. My wife was pretty pleased with this, but I did miss the action. Staring at railroad tracks was like watching paint dry. Sure, I spent more time at home than at work, but the days felt like they dragged on. I was just waiting for something exciting to happen. Anything. And sure enough, something did. It was a grim, rainy day. Everything was gray, and everything was wet. And I remember thinking, great, another boring day. People would rather stay inside and keep dry than go out on a day like this and stir up trouble. Little did I know that mudslides were not unheard of with areas of the railroad on days like this. And we had plenty of landslide scares that day. My wife was pretty worried. She didn't like the idea of me being around a natural disaster. But I told her that after dealing with some pretty scary people in the city, a landslide would be a piece of cake. I was terribly wrong. To make matters worse with her, I had been stuck at work late. I guess that's what happens when you take your quiet life for granted. I had been finishing up for the night. Many of the emergency disaster help had gone home after cleaning up the mudslides, but I wanted to make sure that everything would be safe and okay for the following day. And I also had a very intricate report to fill out. They were detail-oriented, those small town folk, and everything was still pen and paper. No computer screens. My report took a few hours to fill out, and I figured that before I went home, I'd inspect that same area of railroad. So I went back down to that area. The rain had cleared up, but the whole place felt pretty dreary. There was plenty of fog, which reminded me of some old spook show, and I just remember it hitting me and me thinking, wow, this is really creepy. I don't like this. And that's when I saw something out west, towards some trees. I wasn't used to this many trees and being surrounded by full-on nature. I literally forgot about the possibility of a wild animal roaming about. But when I got to remembering, I'm thinking, it's an elk or deer or something like that. That wouldn't be unusual. The only thing that was unusual was that I could actually hear my thoughts out there. But I got back to business. I'm checking off this list of things. I'm really trying to make sure I've got everything covered. And then I hear something moving around off to the west again. So I stopped. I looked around. And I got to wondering about what would happen if I were face to face with an elk. Would the elk hurt me? I didn't know. I had some bear mace. That would work on an elk if it came down to it. Another officer down towards the office called my phone. He was asking if I was all right. I told him, yeah, I was all right, just checking everything out. But I asked if they'd ever been targeted by an elk. I was pleased to hear when he started to laugh. But then he said, but be careful of the wildlife. He explained that they could be dangerous, but to just hang on because he was headed in my direction to help me finish up. Something about the other officer's warning made me a little nervous, and the fog is now laying down so thick that I can't really see if it really is an elk or what. Now I'm thinking it could have been a bear or something far more aggressive. So I climbed into my tiny patrol car and hoped that the vehicle would protect me. That's when I realized my car was facing west. I turned on my brights. And you know what? I'm honestly getting goosebumps thinking about it. I saw what I had been sensing. Out west, something large was standing in the fog. I'm telling you, it was huge. I don't think I've ever seen anything that large in my life. Yes, it was tall, but it was also very wide. Its posture reminded me a little of a gorilla's. Its arms were long and thick, just like its chest. I couldn't really see its legs because the fog was dense, and the thing didn't really seem to have a neck. Now it looked like a gorilla's posture, but it didn't look like a gorilla at all. It didn't look like it had hair. It looked kind of bald, really, and gray. It looked like a gorilla man made of rocks. It was wild. Between the distance and the fog, it was a bit obscured, and it took off into the trees the moment I turned those brights on. By the time the other officer came, I was shaking. He didn't know what I was talking about. He guessed that maybe I'd seen a bear, but it wasn't a bear. There's no way in hell that was a bear. And I still haven't told my wife.